Good afternoon. Welcome to the Chicago Humanities Spring Festival and our program today with Timothy Snyder on freedom. I'm Philip Bahar, I'm the Executive Director of Chicago Humanities, and I'm so appreciative that you're all out here today to have a really important and vital conversation about freedom and democracy. Today marks the first full day of events in our Spring Festival, which features nearly 50 conversations, powerful performances, and other unforgettable events across Chicago and in its many neighborhoods. Throughout the festival, you'll have the opportunity to hear from a wide array of authors, artists, historians, journalists, and thinkers at the heart of our contemporary conversations. And today we'll be exploring what democracy requires of its citizens and leaders, and we're about to hear from Professor Snyder on the meaning of freedom. Throughout the festival, we're considering other critical issues such as transportation infrastructure, climate change, the American school system, and immigration, which we'll cover later on today with Jonathan Blitzer of The New Yorker. At a time when our civic and cultural norms and federal resources are under assault, the power of the humanities to honestly understand and learn from our past, to help us navigate towards possible futures, and to thoroughly give voice to our moment is more essential than ever, and that's why Chicago Humanities is here, to provide a platform for people who can help us see ourselves and our world differently and hopefully bridge some divides. You're here today, so I know that you care about thoughtful, insightful dialogue, challenging your viewpoints and perspectives, and being an informed and considered citizen. So if you love what we do, please do consider joining us at chicagohumanities.org or at our box office on the way out. We literally can't do this work without our audiences and our members, so please do support us if you can. If you're already a member, thank you, thank you, thank you. We really appreciate it. Now, a few words about our guest. Timothy Snyder is a renowned historian specializing in Central and Eastern Europe. He's focused significant attention on the history of Ukraine and authoritarianism, powerfully expressed in his books Bloodlands, Black Earth, The Road to Unfreedom, and On Tyranny, a book I believe we should all be reading at this moment as both a warning and inspiration. You can read it in like 2 hours, and it is well worth thinking about. Recently, Snyder went on leave from a career-long position as professor of history and global affairs at Yale for a new role at the University of Toronto, where he'll continue his work. He'll be joined today by William Howell, who's the inaugural dean of the School of Government Policy at Johns Hopkins University. He's a leading scholar on political institutions and the presidency, and has researched and published on the separation of powers, effective governance, and challenges to democracy. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Guggenheim Fellow, and has authored numerous influential books, including Trajectory of Power and Relic. We're very honored to have him with us and appreciate his leading an insightful conversation earlier today with Heather Cox Richardson and joining Professor Snyder on stage now. So please join me in welcoming William Howell and Timothy Snyder.
This is beautiful space, isn't it?
Yeah, this is wonderful, and everyone in the first row is beautiful. The rest of you, I can't see at all, but I can hear you.
Yeah. Professor Snyder, you've written really an important book on freedom. It's probing, it's wide-ranging, it's at once unsettling and hopeful. It comes in waves. There's history and philosophy, some literature, and a lot of personal biography, too. This is a really personal piece of work. And I'm hoping we can spend some time on the book and unpack it a bit. It comes at a time, a rather fraught time, of anxiety and upheaval and uncertainty, and a time when I don't think many people think that freedom is ascendant. There might be triumphalism. There might be good feeling among some folk. Freedom, I I don't know. And if we might walk through what it is that you mean by freedom. This is in many ways a reflection, a meditation on what it is. And the way you start is with what it isn't. And what it isn't is a clearing away, a notion that it's freedom from, a dispelling that opens up a grand void into which freedom flourishes. You're arguing against that notion.
Yes, it's meant to be a fundamentally reassuring argument in the basic sense that I want to claim that if you get ideas right, it can matter politically. Like, it's not only very satisfying to actually understand what freedom is, but if we did understand, were we to understand what freedom is, it could set a direction towards a better future for the country. Now, the premise of that, as William says, is that we have gotten where we are in large measure by misunderstanding freedom. It may seem like a small mistake to just think that freedom is freedom from, but it actually traps us in many ways. If you think freedom is just freedom from, then you are locating the entire problem of freedom beyond yourself. If you think freedom is just freedom from, then the problem is always the outside world, the government, maybe your neighbor, but it's never you. And if you think that freedom is just freedom from, then politically you'll be led along, as Americans have generally been led along, to the political conclusion that all we need to do is resist the government, make the government smaller, maybe make the government dysfunctional. And of course, when you do that, you end up undermining the very kinds of institutions and practices that make freedom possible. Because freedom, if it's anything, it's not an absence, but it's a presence. The reason why government oppression can be a problem is because of the people who are oppressed. The barbed wire is only a problem because of the people who are behind it. The concentration camp, wherever it might be, is only a problem because of the people inside it. And so the question isn't just what you need to remove. The question is what you have to be able to do together. So I'm working very hard in this book to establish freedom as positive. The reason why freedom is the most important value is not because it galvanizes us to fight against one another, or to claim that government's the problem, or to externalize the problem, or to always be irresponsible, which is where we are. The reason why freedom is the highest value is that it's the state, it's the condition in which we can choose, affirm, and realize values, the things that we think are important. The reason why freedom is the most important good thing is that it's the good thing which allows us to do all of the other good things. And so that means that freedom is positive morally. It's affirming things, not rejecting them. But it also means that freedom has to be positive politically, because it raises the question of how we become that kind of person who cares about things, how we become the kind of people together who are able to affirm things. And so that moves us away from a picture in which it's just a lonely individual trying to break the government, which is not only false, but incredibly destructive, and towards a picture where we have to work together socially, even generationally, to create the conditions in which we can become the kind of people who can be free.
I want to get to the affirmation. But if we could just linger just a bit more, because I want to get real clarity on where the status of negative freedom or freedom from. I don't think it's that you're arguing that there are never cases in which the removal of an impediment or the lifting of a weight isn't freedom enhancing. If I hear you right, it's that our singular preoccupation with those sorts of notions about what freedom is has led us into a place where we are lost, where we have no sense of what is possible, what could be affirmed, where we actually go forward, but that there is place for the removal. No.
This is exactly right. It's that the problem is, just as you say, that the imagination stops at the moment when the problem has been resolved. But what experience and history actually teaches is that that's not enough. So I'm going to take a couple of dramatic examples very quickly, because I think this issue of what freedom is much better resolved in the extreme cases than in the normal cases. I think our normal everyday life has the tendency of not actually raising these questions for us. We have this problem in everyday life that we treat freedom as a cliche. And when we treat it as a cliche, it becomes, just a matter of like our irritations, our impulses, like the things that are on our minds at the moment. So let me give a couple of extreme examples that I think help to clarify this. One of them is from Ukraine, from the 5 visits to Ukraine I've made during the recent war, during the current war. The Ukrainians have a very good word, which is deoccupation, which we don't have in English, but I'm going to introduce to English. It's very tempting when the Russian army has been driven out of a village, let's say, to refer to as liberation. And of course, Ukrainians do that. But they have another word, which I think is more useful, which is deoccupation. And the reason why this is helpful is that it reminds us that no matter how evil something is, just removing it doesn't make you free. So, for example, the case of the village of Yahidne, where the Russians took every single inhabitant of the village and they kept them in the basement of the local school for the entirety of the period of the occupation. And roughly 15% of the population of the village was either murdered or died because of that. Now, when the Ukrainians drove the Russians out of that village, the people could leave the basement, the survivors could. But it would be wrong at that moment to say that they were free, right? It was much better that the Russians were gone. Just to give you a kind of very specific example of what I mean, like when I visited the village, I had to get a key in order to go to the basement and look at it and see what it had been like and see what the children had written on the walls and so on. But, when I handed the key back, the gentleman said, "Can you help us to build a playground?" So at that point, the Russians had been driven out not very long before. There's a huge scale war going on inside the country. Why is he talking about a playground? Because a playground is the kind of thing which little kids need, and they need it all the more when they've just been forced to stay in a basement for the entirety of the Russian occupation. Like, just getting them out of the basement wasn't enough. They needed to have they need more things. So that's not the more extreme example. The more extreme example I want you to think with me about is the liberation, as we say, of concentration camps. I've come to think that that's not the right word. It's incredibly tempting, of course, to think that when the American or the British soldiers arrived in the concentration camps, that what they were doing was liberating. It's irresistible. We'll keep saying that, I'm sure, forever. But if you look at the testimonies of the doctors and the nurses who arrived to treat the survivors of the concentration camps in May and June 1945, you'll see that they use a very different language. And in fact, in their correspondence, in their diaries, you can find them saying things like, "Liberation is not the word." And why do they say that? Because they realize that even though perhaps the worst evil that one can think of, right, SS guards in a concentration camp, have been removed, nevertheless, the people in question are going to need years, decades, a lifetime of care, of health care, of therapy, of love, right, in order to truly become free. So the more extreme the example, I think, the clearer it becomes that just removing an evil can't be the same thing as actually creating the conditions for freedom. And if you see that on the extreme cases, you recognize that it applies to life itself. We are creatures who are born, who are frail, who can get sick, who are going to die. All the way through our lives, there have to be conditions around us that help us to become free. There is never a moment in anybody's life where it's enough to say, let's remove things and then we'll be okay.
What's required are conditions, practices, you call them habits, that bring freedom into being. And it's a rich stew. You lay them out as I'm going to read them out just so we see them. And they can be understood on their own. They also are linked in important ways. And there are reasons why you put them out in this order. Sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, solidarity. These are, again, I'll use your language, the habits that instantiate a positive notion of freedom. Can you tell us a bit about them? It's sovereignty. Why do you start with it? What is it?
So thanks for that. The way the book is structured is that you're always in this privileged position, my position, that I'm dealing with someone who's read the book. And I'm not going to do myself the ridiculous compliment of imagining that you all have read the book. So I'll just say that the way the book is set up is that at the beginning, I do the kind of thing that was solicited in the first question. I try to say philosophically what I think freedom really is. And at the end, in the conclusion, I make the case for what a government would be of a land of the free. What government would look like if government were justified and realized precisely in order to create the conditions of freedom. And in between, the 5 body chapters of the book are what I call these 5 forms of freedom: sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, and solidarity. And they, in various ways, are meant to fill the gap between the thinking and the action. Because the case I'm trying to make in the book is that you can precisely justify government by way of freedom. That in my view, that is what government is actually for. And this whole tension, this imagined tension that we have in American public life between freedom and government is actually imaginary. It's a distraction. It's essentially false. And so the 5 forms are meant to draw our attention to the actual, our actual humanity and what our actual humanity would mean from birth to death if we were going to try to create conditions of freedom. So the 5 forms go in a kind of chronological order, at least up to a point, and they're meant to capture what kinds of creatures we are in an honest way, right? So I mentioned birth in the answer to the last question. Birth is really important. It's no, it is, right? It's funny. It's fun to say that because the women react a good half second before the men. The men are like, "Oh yeah, I was born," whereas the women are like, "Okay." Having been born is arguably, aside from the fact that we're all going to die, people say, Professor Snyder, we're all going to die. I'm yes, we're all going to die. But that's not the bad news, right? The bad news is somewhere else. But so having been born is the thing that we all have in common. And I would submit that any treatment of freedom that doesn't start with birth is unserious. And one way to answer the question about negative freedom that you posed earlier is to point this out. Usually when we talk about negative freedom, we portray a completely reasonable, fully fledged adult individual, right, who is facing some challenge. But how did we get to the point where we created that completely reasonable, fully fledged individual who has the resources to face down a challenge? That's the problem for negative freedom, to which it has no solution. You can't create the individual who can face down a challenge by destroying the government. You can't create that individual negatively. You can only create that individual positively. So unlike negative freedom, which I think is based upon a fantasy, or if you want to put it historically, it's based upon making invisible the conditions in which some people really could be free, but most people could not be free. And tried instead to imagine what the conditions would be in which all of us could be free. And those conditions have to start from childbirth at the latest. Probably pregnancy, probably earlier, but childbirth at the latest, because what we know about human development is that the first 5 years are very, very important. And if you know that, then you would put resources into those first 5 years. And the reason why you would do that is that if freedom is the way that I'm trying to describe it, if freedom involves making choices, affirming values, getting on with other people, cooperating, taking risks. Those are all things that we tend to learn very, very early, right? And so by sovereignty, I'm trying to change what sovereignty means in political philosophy, because I think the most important thing to do is to create what I'm calling a sovereign individual, an individual who's actually capable of enough self-mastery, enough self-confidence to affirm values, to make choices among values. But to get there, we have to pour in a whole lot of work, right? We have to have things like parental leave. We have to make sure that professions like kindergarten teacher or childcare worker are honored and that people get paid for doing that work. We have to recognize that and this is where I think negative freedom precisely goes wrong. Like, we have a taboo in this culture about talking about childbirth at all. And that's a sign of where our conversation about freedom goes wrong. If we're going to have free people going into the next generation, we have to already have in place the institutions, habits, practices that allow us to focus on creating sovereign individuals from the very beginning. So that's why sovereignty comes first.
But then they don't march, these folks that have become sovereign. They become really unpredictable. Why unpredictability as this next instantiation of freedom?
Yeah, I appreciate that. In the long, both in the German and the English language traditions of talking about freedom, the key concept is rationality, and I don't think that's correct. I think rationality is not what's so special about us, which frankly for a lot of us should be a relief, right? Like that. So sorry, I shouldn't laugh at my own jokes. That's really bad form. But because the thing about what rationality often gets reduced to in our conversations about freedom is means ends rationality. So like you're a consumer and like that pineapple is going to make you happy, and so it's rational for you to buy it and so on. That way of thinking about rationality allows us to dodge the questions about what really is important to us. And for me, like freedom, the heart of the question about freedom comes from those things that we actually care about, the things that we in fact care about. Maybe not the things we admit we care about, but the things that we actually think are beautiful and valuable and true. And what's special about us, what makes us different from everything else in the universe, except maybe dolphins and octopi, is that you can always tell like who's read the books about the octopi, like this. But what makes us special in the world is that we can affirm values. That's what makes us special, right? We're physical, right? We're physical creatures. We're subject to the laws of physics. But not only, we can also do things because we care about them. And that involves unpredictability, because the ways that you ascertain what's important to you, the jumble and tumble of values that's inside your mind when you make decisions is not just all yours and unique, it's inherently unpredictable. So, I can say like these chairs are of equal weight and that lectern is heavier, right? In the physical world, you can say something is bigger or heavier than other things, but you can't say that honesty is more important than loyalty. You can't. Those are just different values. And you have to make judgments on your own about how you're going to balance them. You can't say punctuality is more important than spontaneity, right? You're going to have to choose between those two things, one after the other, right? And that is, those things are like the geometry of that is not Euclidean, right? That it's not, you're not in a world of classical physics. You're in a world where things don't add up, where you have no choice but to make these unpredictable affirmations. And so that's what we are. Like when we're free, we're unpredictable creatures. We not only unpredictable in and of ourselves, we're pushing unpredictability out into a universe, right? We're pushing unpredictability into a universe which wouldn't know it otherwise. at least not in this form. That's what's special about us, and that's the positive version, right? Positive freedom, if it's about affirming values, is going to make unpredictable creatures out of us, and you can tell who's free, I think, in this way. At the same time, the negative side of this argument, the negative point is those who wish to oppress us, as you might have noticed, try to make you predictable. They try to hitch your mind to social media algorithms, which are based upon what is most predictable about you, what you're afraid of, right? What makes you frightened, what gives you a quick shot of pleasure, what stimulates you, your demographic. The most boring things about you are what social media seizes and tries to take over your personality with. So predictability is how you get ruled, because if we know what you're going to do, if we know how you're going to react, you're going to be very easy to rule. And so governing strategies, if that's the right word, that the world we're in now is largely based upon trying to make people predictable, by not just by knowing about them, but by getting them caught up in cycles where they become more predictable than they otherwise would be.
And so the unpredictability is not just the realization or the practice of freedom, it also is the guard against those that would take it away. And the unpredictability, in turn, depends upon the sovereignty. It's hard to imagine genuine unpredictability as you've described it in a world in which we don't have fully formed, autonomous, kind of flourishing individuals who have actual values. Yeah?
That's exactly right. The sovereignty comes before the unpredictability in the person, right, in the life, but it also comes before it logically. Because when I say unpredictability, what I mean is unpredictability in the sense that your own set of values is not only unique, but the way you combine it is inherently unpredictable. It has to be unpredictable. But as you say, you have to become the kind of person who's capable of doing that. That is like the world of values, to use a term that several of the philosophers in my book use. The world of values is inherently unpredictable, but you have to be somebody who's inhabiting that world of values, and that doesn't come on its own.
We can't go through all five, but we've got to do mobility. Tell us what it is, how it flows from these first two, sovereignty and unpredictability.
So yeah, the third of these forms is mobility. And again, it's meant to capture some basic things that are true about life. So if we set up sovereignty as the collective effort, which of course involves family, but also friends and daycare workers and everybody else, to create the conditions in which a young person can become, next step, unpredictable. And of course, in the unpredictability chapter, you're also going to find my long Jeremiad against social media.
But we're going to come to that.
Yeah. So the unpredictable person is then going to rebel against the very structures which allowed him or her or them to become an unpredictable person. And that's normal, right? That is to be, in my view, encouraged. It would be strange if it were not true. And mobility mobility means reconciling oneself to that. That, of course, we're not going to reproduce ourselves in the literal sense of having exact copies. That if we have children, those children are going to want to do different things, right? As I'm reminded every day by my actual children, who are in some sense, co-authors of this particular chapter. So you want to be in a situation where they can rebel. Rebellion is normal. You should not just expect it, but it should be it's part of a society which you might be able to call land of the free, that each generation is going to have different ideas. And for example, protest, that's also normal. And so then the question arises, as with sovereignty and unpredictability, what is the work that you have to do to make that possible? Because as in every case, just like you can't expect a newborn baby to create all the conditions in which that newborn baby can grow up to be sovereign, just as you can't expect a young person to create the whole environment in which that young person become unpredictable, you can't expect an 18-year-old to create all the conditions that are necessary to be mobile, right? That 18-year-old cannot himself, herself, build all the roads. That 18-year-old cannot create functioning, affordable public universities, right? It's absurd. I mean, this all goes back to the negative freedom question, because if you're in a world of negative freedom, what you say is you've arrived, you're an adult, right? And so now it's all up to you. But that is absurd. It's crazy. An 18-year-old cannot create Ohio State University. An 18-year-old cannot create, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, right? An 18-year-old cannot create the things that are necessary in order for that person to be mobile. And by mobile, I mean having a different kind of life than the parents. I also mean physically mobile, being able to get on ideally a train, if you let me just dream. But an 18-year-old should be able to get on a train and go to another city and go to university, which is affordable, and study something and have a life which is commensurate with what they want to do, and which is enabled by a society which is precisely structured around that possibility that they can be mobile. That's what I mean by mobility.
And the investments that allow for the mobility, this too, the contrast with a negative, it's not just wide open spaces. There are pathways, and there are people along those pathways to facilitate the transport.
Yeah, and that part of what I'm after is trying to describe all of that in terms of freedom. Yeah. I mean, in this, going back to Ukraine is a very striking thing. But I mean, there's a country where there's an actual war going on and territory is taken and retaken. And one of the things that the Ukrainians do is that they will say, and this is just, I dwell on this because I think it's very striking for us in our world of negative freedom. If a city or a town has been, as we would say, liberated, okay, they do plant the flag, like everybody would plant the flag. But what a lot of Ukrainians think is really significant is the train running again, right? Because if the train is running again, then the town actually is free. You can get there, you can go back, right? And for them, throughout this whole war, actually, just in case you don't know, their train system has been running incredibly well. It's not just more impressive than ours; it's more impressive than the Germans. And they're mocking the Germans for this the entire time. And one should know, if you're not following the Ukrainian rail system on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever, this is what they do. They make fun of the Germans for not being on time enough. And frankly, since they're at war, I think we should allow them this minor sin. But I say this because I want this whole thing, as you say, the institutions, the people along the way who enable things like mobility. I want us to think about that as freedom, because it is freedom. It is freedom. If you're 18 and there's a state university you can afford, that is freedom. If you're 18 and there's a train that will take you across the country, that is freedom. We have been trained to think that all these things, insofar as they involve cooperation or, God forbid, paying taxes, that therefore they are against our freedom. And that is an ideology which has left us much less free than we would be otherwise. So.
I hope you all can hear just the number of registers that this book is operating under. There's, at a very high level, a set of core concepts and an effort to get us to reconsider those concepts at a high level. It also, though, again, is a book that is working in detail and nuance and dropping into specific places. And again, many of them are very personal in nature. It's a profound book and worth spending a great deal of time with. I wonder if you might take a bit of time and say, given these observations, we're in this present political moment. Again, it's a moment where it doesn't feel like freedom is ascendant. Are there pockets of places where you see it flourishing? If so, where are those places?
So I wrote this book over the course of 7 years. I started thinking about it way back in 2017 when I was on the road with On Tyranny. So I wrote On Tyranny as very quickly in a few days. And it's striking, William is very kindly describing this book, and I hope it does have these layers, and I hope it does speak to itself in the ways that you're describing, but it's a very different kind of book than On Tyranny, and I want to just try to explain that because it helps answer the question. I wrote on tyranny very quickly as a reaction when Trump won in November of 2016, because I had this feeling that Americans would say things like the institutions will rescue us and so on. And of course, Americans did say that, and that's crazy and wrong. And I had this idea that Americans would say things like, well, this is America, it can't really happen here, which is of course crazy and wrong. Here is the only place it has ever happened. Yes, the logicians in the front row love that one. The book is written, not as a reaction to anything which has just happened, is what I'm trying to say. It was written over the course of a long time trying to answer the question, a question which I got during the On Tyranny stuff. I mean, I spent much of 2017 marching around talking to churches and synagogues and civil society groups and anybody who would listen to me about how bad things were going to get. And the 20 lessons of On Tyranny were about playing defense. But it's a very legitimate question. Playing defense is important, right? Going back to the whole question about negative and positive freedom. But there's a very legitimate question which I got asked back then, which was, okay, this is fine. This helps us to defend and act, and that's good, and recognize. But what are we actually doing this for? What are we doing this for? And that's why I wrote on freedom, is that I wanted to try to say what freedom was. Not just how you can tell it's being threatened, but what it in fact is. And the reason why I was doing that is partly because it was a challenge and I wanted to get right, and it was hard, but also because I wanted to help give us that an organizing principle and that idea of the future. Because you can't fight against what's going wrong around us with a battle cry of let's go back to 2024 or let's go back to 2019 or whatever it is. Nobody wants to do that. You can only do it in terms of a future. And freedom is meant to provide an idea. It's meant to provide the shape in which you can have ideas of the future. Because in negative freedom, as you might have noticed, negative freedom keeps you in a kind of eternal present. It's you against the government. Okay, it's you against the government today, and it's you against the government tomorrow, and it's you against the government the day after that. That is not a future. That is a trap. That is a trap. Whereas if you think of freedom as this is a project for the children, this is a project for 40 years from now, this is a project for the land of the free, then you start to think, okay, there's a future involved. And having a future is much more consistent with democracy than being stuck in the eternal present the entire time. And so I wrote the book to try to make that easier. And yes, of course, I see signs of hope. I see signs of hope when people do unpredictable things, right? So when Booker and Jeffries are sitting on the Capitol steps today, I think, great, that's probably going to work, doing things like that. Or the town halls, which of course require actually a fair amount of work to get done, but sending Democrats out into, Republican districts and having them talk to people. That's a little weird, but those are the kinds of things which are actually making a difference. The protests, much more important, I think, than people generally credit. It matters a lot when people get their bodies out and they're with new people and they're taking just a tiny, tiny bit of risk. Yeah. So I do see, I mean, you didn't ask me what I'm worried about, which I appreciate, although I'm happy to answer it if it's the next question. But yeah, I do see signs of hope. And interestingly, I just want to point out, we're a very provincial country. A lot of the signs of hope actually come from abroad, because one thing that I have noticed, I've spent a lot of this year, I've spent a fair amount of this year in Ukraine and a fair amount of this year, in the Midwest, and a fair amount of this year in Canada. And one of the things that I've noticed is that across borders, the conversation about Trump is much simpler than it is inside the US, because across borders, you don't have the cognitive dissonance and you don't have the charisma, because nobody feels it. It's no, it's true. You drive across the Canadian line and boom, it's a very clear change. And that's very clarifying. But I just want to note that the way that Ukrainians have to fight this war, regardless of how insane our policy is, or the way that Canadians rally, the way that people show actually that you can resist this, right? You can call things by their name and resist. That's, I think, a helpful thing to note, right? That some of the hope actually comes from the rest of the world. The way that, democratic leaders inside Europe, Starmer, Macron, Merz, Tusk, have pretty healthy, grounded reactions to what's happening in the U.S. That can be very helpful. And so the fact that we're not really alone in the world may be a source of hope as well.
Great. We're going to put up a QR code on this big screen, which will allow you, if you'd like to ask a question of Professor Snyder, you can post your question through that QR code. Before we turn to such questions, I wonder, this is going to sound like I'm cheapening the book, but I just want to see if I'm reading this in ways that might align with your intention. One way to think about the book is a sort of self-help book about how to be free, right? I could read it this way. If I undergo these habits and embrace these practices, then I myself stand a better chance of being free. You flip it, is that in being free, in myself being free, if that is understood as itself as a form of political dissidence, a form of resistance to those who would impose tyranny, those who would assert kind of arbitrary rule, the book can be read as a kind of a manifesto on how to fight back. But that those things collapsed into one. In being free, one is at once resisting those who would take away freedom. Would you? Do I get to read it that way, or are you not going to let me?
I think, it would be really against the spirit of the book not to let you read it. Again, in that way. So I would describe the fruitful tension this way. On the one hand, being a free person is always going to involve a little bit of oddness and eccentricity and unpredictability. And I get a lot of this myself from the anti-communist dissidents who were in some way sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly my teachers, who were for the most part not mainly against something, but mainly affirming the various things they thought were important. And they were against communism insofar as it got in the way, right? And so they began from very small claims about defending good things, like speaking the language that you want, or listening to the music that you want, or even in the case of Václav Havel, brewing beer the way that you think beer ought to be brewed. The Chicago microbrewery crowd is here. And they work their way outward from there. And that's really important. I don't think you can do resistance without that. I don't think you can do resistance with being the same way that the people who are oppressing you are. I don't think you can do resistance by saying, everybody show up and here's your lanyard and we're all going to do the same thing. On the other hand, you also have to think about creating the conditions in which more people can be like that, right? So the thing about the East European dissidents is that there weren't that many of them. There were a few. And they had various kinds of support networks behind them, which made it possible for them to do what they were going to do. And the question is then, how do you create those support networks? And that's the legitimate task for politics. So of course you have to lean forward, but you also have to be thinking, when we win or as we win, how do we create the practices and institutions that allow other people to be themselves?
Terrific. We have a question. As an educator in your book, you referenced teaching incarcerated students. Can you say a bit about how that work that you did and your engagement with them informed your understanding of freedom, what it requires, what its possibilities are?
So teaching in prison is a good example in a way of the tension that we were just talking about, this fruitful tension, because on the one hand, yeah, I did it. I taught in a maximum security facility in Connecticut, but I could only do that because of the Yale Prison Education Initiative, which is an institution, led by people who put their hearts into it and make it possible. So I did that thing, which was important to me, but I could only do it because there were people who were laying down the work ahead of me. it was important to me because when I write a book about freedom, I have to recognize, and I do it from a personal perspective, as you've kindly noted a couple of times already. I have to be aware that my America, touching as it might be for me and resonant as it might be for some, has to be also an America of mistakes. So I start the book with a scene of me in 1976, the American bicentennial, ringing a bell on my grandparents' farm. And I do that to show, that we are going to be talking about tradition, we're going to be talking about the history of the United States. But I also do it because I'm trying to show that some of the things that I had already understood by the age of 6 about the U.S., charming and inviting and seductive as they might have been to a child, were in fact wrong and dangerous. And so in order to understand, how my way into the U.S. history is just my way, I had to confront it with other ways. I had to confront my youth with other youths. And the easiest way to do that was to teach in a prison, because there I was teaching not only young people, some of them were quite young. One of my students was about my age, but there I was teaching people whose way into American history was quite different than my own, and whose youth, and this is the most important thing, going back to the conversation about sovereignty and unpredictability, which are concepts I talked with them quite a lot about, by the way, whose youth was very often quite different than mine. So for example, there was a very, most of my students were African American, and which is not just an aside, right? That's essential to the whole conversation, that most of them are African American, because some of the things that I could afford, as it were, not to understand as a young person had to do with African American history. I could afford not to understand how important the history of slavery was. That's possible, right? I could afford not to understand the way that an us and them is built into a lot of American culture. And so in writing about how we could be a land of the free, I had to make sure, it's not about beating myself up, right? It's about making sure that the way I talk about U.S. history has other entrances besides my own entrance. It has to do with listening. And this is key, try to say this without making myself sound so wise, because it's a very simple point. But freedom has to involve empathy. Freedom has to involve empathy, and not just in the sense that it's nice to be nice to people, but in a deeper epistemic sense. If freedom really is about being an individual, that is something that you can't do on your own. In all the ways that we've talked about, you can't actually become an individual on your own. That's not possible. If you're left as a newborn, outside and exposed to the elements, you are not going to grow up to become a free individual. You're going to die. You need help all along the way to become an individual. And part of the help that you need has to come from others. If you to become the person who knows what you care about, who knows who you are, you have to listen to other people. It's necessary. We are not authorities on who we are, right? I say this as somebody who's written a number of biographies. You can't actually write a biography by just asking somebody, "Oh, so tell me about yourself." That's not how it works. And that's true. And as the authors of our own lives, that's also not how it works. We have to listen to everybody else. And so we all go through. I was having dinner with some friends of mine last night, who old friends of mine, and I had something on my cheek, and of course, and my friend across the table said, "You got something on your cheek," So I took it. That's what life is like, okay? There are things on your cheek that you can't take off. They're just there. But you don't know unless somebody else tells you, right? That's we all going through life with metaphysical spinach between our teeth. And you don't know that unless somebody else tells you. But you won't listen to them unless you take them seriously as a person, which seems simple, but it's not, right? I think you have to be empathetic to them. And if you're empathetic to them, then you can listen to them talk about you, and then that helps you to become a free individual. So it was a seminar, and I needed to listen, right? And the students were they were very good about all of this, because of course, from their point of view, and they never said it like this, never. But like from their point of view, I was a very privileged, wealthy, middle-aged white guy. But they were extremely good at treating the entire thing as an intellectual discussion where we were talking about philosophers and in which they were bringing their own perspectives, but also their own reading. And something that can't be understated about teaching incarcerated students is that these are very selective programs. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people apply for a few spots. And the amount of talent that we have in our carceral system is stunning, right? Sad, stunning. And so the students who were in this seminar were incredibly good. It was actually the best seminar, with all apologies to the institutions with whom I'm affiliated. It was the best seminar I've ever taught. These students were incredibly good, and the book owes a lot to them, and I try to make that clear along the way.
Threats to freedom. You gestured towards this earlier. We have a question that's inviting you to bring it front and center, and that is social media. You don't have kind things to say about it, and it might even be thought of as not just something that disrupts or distracts, but that's something that oppresses and nullifies your notion of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, starting from one side, just looking at it objectively, there's a reason why we're in trouble. And it's not, there are things that have changed in the last 15 years which have made democracy harder. And I think number one is probably social media. Wealth inequality is probably number two, but I think in terms of things that have changed, social media is number one. And social media has made us less empathetic. It's made us less capable of understanding the world around us. It's unfortunately the case that it's made us all stupider, which is a point I try to remember to make in public because it's awkward. Like, it's really awkward to say, guys are all dumber than you were the last time I was in Chicago. Okay, you're still smart enough to laugh, right? Like, 5 years from now, it's going to be like stony silence because it's going to be too late. But so the way that social media is designed to make us not the kinds of creatures that I was talking about. Like, I think in order to be free, we have to be unpredictable. We have to have our own authors, our own books, our own authorities, our own sources, our own set of values, our own way of being in the world. Social media is constructed on a money-making scheme, which is based on attention, and the simplest way to get attention, as the people in charge know, is to follow the program which was established by behavioralist research in the middle of the 20th century, which is affirm, deny, affirm, deny, affirm, deny, right? Those experiments with the rats and the pigeons, those are not legal to do if you call them experiments. But if you call it social media, then we're all in one big experiment, which we are, right? And the experiment shows that we, like the rats and pigeons, but unlike the octopuses, I'm just going to point this out, like the rats and the pigeons, we are predictable, and what's worse, we can be made more predictable. And that's for me is the thing which is crushing, that we can be more unpredictable. We can also be less unpredictable, and there's a lot of money to be made by making us more predictable, and that is basically the game. Now, I understand social media can be used smartly, but only if you have a notion of what you're doing with it. Just like with the laws of gravity, right? It's not if you know what the laws of gravity are. Okay, you don't have to know that it's 9.80 meters per second squared, but if you understand gravity, you can dance, right? If you understand gravity, you can walk. The things that are constraints can also be limitations. That's part of the argument of the book. Negative freedom would suggest you can just clear away all the limitations. You can't. You're not clearing away the law of gravity, right? But you can take the limitations and you can turn them into capacities. And the same is true with social media. If you understand how it works, then you can say, okay, I'm not going to doom scroll all day, but I will use it in a targeted way, for example, to organize a protest, right? I will use it in the service of other things precisely because I know how it works. But if we skip the step of knowing how it works then it's like just slipping on a banana peel. I'm going back to gravity, like over and over and over again.
We're nearing the end. I have just one last question for you. If the social media is depleting, say a bit about the humanities, and about, now you have to say something nice. We're setting you up. You have to say nice stuff about the Chicago humanities in particular, but the humanities more broadly as a ground not just for distraction from trouble, but for a place to enliven and instantiate freedom itself.
Yeah, I know. Thank you for that. That's a very kind question and a lovely way to end this conversation, for which I thank you. You can see the negative side before your eyes. There is a reason why the humanities are targeted. There is a reason why in the public schools in Ohio, which just happens to be a place I follow a little bit more closely than other places because I'm from there. But there's a reason why, as the public schools are defunded, the first things to go are art and music. And then after that, it's foreign languages and then English. There's a reason why history is not taught seriously. There's a reason why these things are hit first. There's a reason why when public universities are defunded, the first thing that happens is that the humanities are consolidated into some kind of overall generic direction. There's a reason why literature and languages go first. And the reason is that the people who are ultimately behind this are not concerned with human freedom. I understand that claims are made on behalf of efficiency, but the thing is, we don't need more efficiency. We need people who know how to make their own decisions, who know what they care about. And taking the premise of the question and accepting it and endorsing it, the only way to become such people is to have access to other people. That is the only way to do it. A human cannot decide what is important to that human without contact with other people. And the magic of the humanities, including the arts, by the way, the magic of the arts and the humanities is that they are technologies that allow you to have contact with all kinds of people from all sorts of positions with all kinds of different commitments. So at your local library, on the fiction shelf, you have access to a set of values, an unpredictable group of commitments, which is bigger than the entire internet, if you choose to look at it, right? If you're taught music, or if you're taught art, you have access to aesthetic and other values. But if you're not taught them, you don't get those. If you have literature and history, then you have a chance of seeing your own world from an infinitude of different points of view. If you have literature and history, those two things in particular, then you're able to see how other people, whether they're created by authors or whether they're historically real, how other people process the world and what values those other people are juggling. If you don't have those things, you can't really become free, right? The more of it, the better. The more of it, the better, and the earlier, the better, which is why taking the art, the thing which actually hits me the hardest is taking the art and the music out of schools at the beginning. Like the earlier, the earlier, the more important. The earlier it is, the more important that it is. But and it doesn't have to be complicated stuff. It can be very simple stuff, but it just has to be history and literature and philosophy and the arts. Because without those things, it's like every day is a new day, but in the bad sense, right? Like you wake up every day and things happen and you don't know how to evaluate them or how you stand on them. And whatever big lie or master narrative is out there, you go for it, you fall for it because you don't have the tools to critique it, but also you don't have the tools to have your own story and to force your own story out on to the world.
The book is on freedom. Timothy Snyder.